Hare Krishna, Mayesvara Prabhu, speak next.
Namam Vishnu Vidaya Krishna Vistaya Bhutlade Shimanti Bhaktivedanta Swami Niti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devan Gauravani Pacharane Nivashesha Sanyavati Prashkata Deshatarane. So every year at Prabhupada's appearance day, I find myself naturally thinking, where would I be today if I hadn't bumped into Prabhupada somewhere in the past? And I think all of us, if we take a minute to think of that, at least for me, I don't really want to think about it too much. I was a terror in high school in terms of I didn't do very well. I tormented my mother with my grades. I was getting in all sorts of mischief. And I was told, you just got to keep in school, stay in school, stay in school. And of course, after high school, it was like, well, now you got to go to college. And the thing is, I didn't find any value in any of it. I had to read books like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and I just couldn't find any reason to read those books. And so I was actually really pretty bad academically. I liked tinkering and taking things apart and asking questions, but every time I asked questions, and I'd go to different places, like church, whatever it was, Buddhist meditations, New Age groups, and I just never felt that the answers were there. So anyhow, eventually convinced my parents, believe it or not, to let me drop out of college for a year after my second year. And my relationship with Prabhupada is extremely mystical because I didn't really know exactly what it was going to do, but I knew I had to do it. And I knew I had to do it someplace other than where I was at the time, which was at the University of Kansas in the middle of the country. So I got together with friends and I went to Europe and traveled all over the place, got a Euro pass, and somehow ended up in Paris and came around the corner and ran right into the Harinam Sankirtan party, which actually I'd run into them in New York several years earlier in high school, coming out of the Biltmore Theater after watching the play Hair, which actually had the devotees in it. And I didn't have my glasses at the time, and they were way down the street, and I couldn't really see, but they all looked like saffron. And I asked a friend of mine when I heard the sounds, I said, "What is that?" And he said, "They're Buddhists." But I didn't quite hear him properly, and what I heard was, "They're nudists." So I went, okay, we're getting out of here fast. So anyhow, I went to the Paris temple with my friends, two college friends. And if you're familiar with the old Paris temple, it was on that strange corner. They had a little tiny elevator, and somehow I got separated. And my very first contact actually listening to anything Krishna conscious was extremely, like we say, you don't have to understand the words, but if you're paying attention, the meaning will go through. And I was just basically opened the door and found myself sitting in the Paris temple room, and somebody was giving a lecture. And everybody was sitting around just like we're sitting here now. And I didn't understand a word of it because I don't speak French. But I was sitting there and I was observing how, just like now, everybody was paying attention. It was a Sunday class, I think. It was a Sunday feast, actually. And I was observing very carefully, and I was going, I don't know what's going on here, but it's got my attention. And eventually, that was 1973, the Max 72 Bhagavad Gita had just come out. They handed it, it went through. I'm really shortening this down because I only have a few minutes, but they handed me on the way out, they actually gave, I had read the Bhagavad Gita before. It was little tiny penguins, like practically paper thin, because I knew there was something there, but it was totally disappointed by it. And the devotee explained to me, you read the wrong one. And somehow I understood that. Of course, I was traveling out of a backpack, and then he handed me this Bhagavad Gita that looked like a brick, and I was going, there's no way I'm putting that in my backpack. So anyhow, but I promised him I'd get it when I came back to the United States. And one of the mystical things was, because it was printed by Macmillan, it was actually at the University of Kansas bookstore, because I was 300 miles away from any temple. And I walked in, and sure enough, there was one sitting there. I picked it up, read it, started reading it. Took me a long time because I hated to read, but I found that as I was reading Prabhupada's Bhagavad Gita, I started realizing actually I like to read because now I found something worth reading. And And then, of course, the big anxiety that came up was, wait a minute, what am I doing in this college? I ought to be a devotee. And the big anxiety was, how in the heck am I going to, because my parents were like, yeah, you got to do the 4 years of college. And I had only gotten through about 3 of them, and I'm going, that back then the mood was college is a waste of time. So I was praying very, very, just in anxiety, Krishna, you got to do something. You got to do something. I don't know how to do this. I can't do it on my own. You got to do something. And then sure enough, after about 3 or 4 months, I got a phone call from Budara, who was one of the lead men on the Radha Damodar traveling Sankirtan party. And the next thing I know, I had 30 devotees basically knocking on my door. They were doing programs all over the University of Kansas. I participated with them, not realizing at the time that I was probably not going to go back to school. I thought I would just help them out and go back to school. And halfway through that whole experience, I realized, wait a minute, I've been praying for something like this to happen, and now it's happening. And what am I going to do? I'm just going to go back to school? And, it was just sort of like I was kicking myself in the head, and Christian kind of tricked me, and I realized I can't go back to school. I just skipped classes for a week. And at that time, the devotees were could sort of see what was going on, and they started coming around and saying, well, before we leave, we can use a few things. We could use a few pots. Can you help us out? We can use some of your clothes for the sacrament. Can you help? We can use some of your tools. And they went through everything in my apartment, and then they kind of stood at me, and I kind of looked at them, and they looked at me, and they said, there's one last thing we need. And it was me. I mean, it chokes me up, because it was like, it just happened. It just happened. And I jumped on the bus, and that's how I became a devotee. And I want to thank Prabhupada, because when I think about where I'd be today, I live in Ojai. I meet a lot of very, very strange people who believe a real lot of very strange things. And I would probably be a pretty hardcore atheist, because nothing else really makes any sense. But Krishna consciousness beats it all. So thank you all.
Hi, thank you, Mahesh. Ruja Dev, Prabhu.